ठीक है, ठीक आ रहा है. Okay. How many of us are aware of the female warriors or the female rulers of India? What got you interested in the first place?
History has been a passion throughout. I have enjoyed reading history from childhood.
I'm surprised and amazed that 20 years hence, we still go back to teaching history in the same very boring way. And that is the reason a lot of us
Don't like
don't like it. And yours was the first time when I got to know that Prabhavati Gupta, in fact, led for a good 20-30 years.
She became the regent queen when her husband died, leaving her a very young widow. Probably she must have hardly been around 20-25 then, with 3 very small boys. My views on feminism are not the typical views that you read, It doesn't mean that you need to be out there fighting and all that. For me, about agency, about the choice to do what you want to.
Tell me about that entire process and art of, putting together a story, a fictional story around history.
It's tough.
I was amazed when I read about having a woman warrior who actually pushed back, not just pushed back, but also defeated the Mughals. Yes, and she was popularly known as Nakkati, and Shah Jahan himself gave her that connotation. And a lot of problems in families and in homes are today happening because women don't want to give up their careers.
I guess one has to be adaptable. Adaptability is key. Okay, you have some set ambitions, you have some set thoughts, but sometimes things may not go the way you want them to go.
Welcome, Harini, to the show. I am so delighted, and especially to recall that the first episode I think we did with the then Between the Lines was with you in Pune, if I recall it correctly. And it was on Curse of Anuganga, if I'm not wrong. So thank you very much for making time today. I would like you to probably briefly tell us about the 2 books that you've written, especially in the genre of history, historical thrillers.
First of all, thank you very much, Lipika. Namaskar, everyone. I'm Harini Srinivasan. So, to answer your question, Lipika, about my 2 books, I have written The Curse of Anuganga, which came out exactly 5 years ago. As Lipika mentioned, it is a murder mystery set in the Gupta period. In fact, in the age that is called the Vakataka Gupta age. It is set in a city called Nandivardhan, and the story is actually a very simple one, There is a gentleman who gets murdered on the eve of his daughter's second wedding, and a jeweler's son who is there at the time making jewelry, because back in those days, Lipika, jewelers had their workshops, but for noblemen or for rich people, rich, established, eminent people of the society, if there was a wedding that would take place, the jewelers would go there, set up a workshop kind of place in their annex and craft the jewelry right then and there. So my main protagonist, Shaunaka, lands up as an apprentice because his father is the prime most eminent established jeweler of Nandivardhan at that time. So Shaunaka stumbles upon this murder quite accidentally, and the story is about how he gets inducted as a spy into the official police force and starts assisting Kalidasa, whom I have cast in a different light, and solves this particular murder mystery. So that was The Curse of Anuganga. Now, in Shadows and Secrets, Shaunaka, it's some months have passed. Shaunaka is now an established spy, no longer a jeweler, no longer an apprentice with his father, but assisting the local police force in Nandivardhan. And he's entrusted with a secret or with some message to be passed on to somebody, some minister in Patliputra. So as he goes, the story moves from Nandivardhan and goes to Patliputra, where he kind of finds himself in a much larger conspiracy, and he assists them in bringing to light what the conspiracy is. So Shadows and Secrets is not a very typical murder mystery like The Curse of Anuganga. The Curse of Anuganga was much smaller. So in the sense, okay, one person has been killed, and why was he killed?
So that was more a who done it, and this is how done it.
Yeah, this is actually how and why done it, actually, more than how also.
Interesting. This brings me to the point of asking you as to what got you interested in the first place in history and specifically the Gupta period?
History has been a passion throughout. I have enjoyed reading history from childhood. Maybe it is the fact that I got hooked on to Amar Chitra Kathas at the age of 3 or 4.
We all did.
We all did. Yeah, that generation. And the
Yeah.
love for stories continued. And unlike a lot of other people who had others, when we were young, I had a lot of friends who did not like history because they didn't want to remember dates. I happen to remember dates, and hence history was one of my favorite subjects.
Hats
No
off
matter
to you,
how
but
it was taught.
I feel that, and since you mentioned it, I think the way it is taught is exclusively boring.
It's exclusively boring, yeah.
It's excruciatingly boring.
It is.
And the problem is that even till today, when I'm teaching my children, it continues to be that. I'm surprised and amazed that 20 years hence, we still go back to teaching history in the same very boring way. And that is the reason a lot of us
Don't like it.
Don't like
But
it.
actually, history is nothing but about how our people who inhabited this earth before us lived, and what kind of problems they faced, what kind of challenges they faced, and how they surpassed it, and how life and culture and civilization has continued. So
Right.
think of it as a lot of short interconnected stories that unfortunately keep getting repeated in the generations that follow, because
And
human-
stories, a lot of them have been forgotten.
have
as
been
well.
forgotten as well. Exactly.
Probably deliberately by the academicians who have actually killed the subject for us in a lot of ways. I'm sorry to say, but the academia is to be blamed the most
Very
for
true.
our dislike for history.
Yes.
But given that, and given your prowess to remember dates, how did that move towards your passion to? Was history your subject when you wrote your IS exams?
Yes.
The civil service.
Yes.
So that was
history
exactly
is
what
one
I
of my
wanted.
subject was one of my subjects when I took the civil services way back.
Yeah.
And you're right when you say that academia has killed history, and the way the history has been taught. Unfortunately, maybe because we live in Delhi also, it's very Delhi focused. So which means all we learned about was Mughals and the British Raj, that period. Your previous question was about how I got interested into the Gupta period. To be honest, okay, my interest in the Gupta period, or in fact in ancient India, stirred once again to say, I'd read all these Amar Chitra Kathas, but obviously somewhere along the way I had kind of stopped reading history as such, and whatever history or historical fiction I would read was very Mughal centric. In around 2015, when the Curse of Anuganga started becoming an idea in my head, because I was a part of a writers group, that time we decided to pick one particular period in Indian history and write a historical story based on that. At that time, I actually wanted to pick up the Mughal period, to be very honest, because
Wow.
that was what I was comfortable with. Because writing a historical story requires research. But
true.
whatever it was, I had to get out of my comfort zone, and I thought, okay, I had heard about the Gupta age, so it was not like as I didn't know about it. So I said it was the golden age of Indian Hindu civilization. So why don't I pick that up? And I once again started my research, and that's how I got back into it. Now, 8-9 years later, if I can say, I think I know the Gupta period a little bit more than what I remember of the Mughal period.
No, I'm so glad to hear that because, frankly, it's not just reading a lot about the Mughal period, but also through the history books being repeatedly told that, actually there was nothing in the Bharatiya civilization that actually pushed back the invaders. To continue to batter that into your heads that there were no warriors who actually stood up to the and Mughals were the kind-hearted ones who when they came in, they completely embraced the Indian culture and Bharatiya culture and became part of it. But I'm glad that there are writers like you who are now researching on other periods which talk about the glory of Bharat, which highlight how in a lot of ways Bharat was not really what it is portrayed to be of weak people. So, Gupta period, when I was reading a little bit more, especially in order to talk to you about Prabhavati Gupta, which could be just one mention or some mention here in the first book and does not find a mention in the second. But why I wanted to pick and talk about her is that now when I see historians talking about the glory of Bharat, and when I see them talking and sharing information about the warriors and the rajas and the maharajas of Bharat, who right from Marathas to in the northeast, very rarely still do I find mention of women. And yours was the first time when I got to know that Prabhavati Gupta, in fact, led the Vakataka dynasty
Yes.
for a good 20-30 years.
13 years at one stretch easily.
Yeah.
She became the regent queen when her husband died, leaving her a very young widow. Probably she must have hardly been around 20, 25 then, with 3 very small boys. She took over as the regent queen on behalf of her sons, and she led she ruled the kingdom from say 390 CE till easily around 410 to 414, which is when her son
Wow.
became the king.
But tell me something, all the queens that I was reading about, mostly I see them actually as caretakers of the future, king. So mostly what has happened is that they, by way of losing their husbands and having very young children, were made to lead.
Made to lead, but then the moment they were made to lead, they took charge of
yeah.
this thing. So maybe they did not become queens or on their own, trying to grapple
They
for
were
power.
not the natural heirs,
Natural
except
heirs.
for probably Ahilyabai Holkar, where
Even for Ahilyabai Holkar, it was because her husband died.
correct,
You
yeah.
know, but
And then father-in-law,
and
as
father-in-law
well
also passed
yeah.
away, and father-in-law basically by then had trained Ahilya Holkar to become the queen and said that no, you cannot give up, you need to look after my kingdom. So it was a promise that was extracted by her.
Correct.
See, we were talking about feminism earlier. My views on feminism are not the typical views that you read, it doesn't mean that you need to
Be out there with
fighting and all
banners
that.
and screaming and shouting.
It's about agency. Feminism
True.
is for me about agency, about the choice to do what you want to. So it's not like, and all these women, if you look at all these women, they had agency. Prabhavati may not have started out that way because hers was, I believe, a very political marriage.
Okay.
Now, the Vakatakas were in the west, and Chandragupta too was the biggest ruler at that time, and there was this threat from the Shakas. Now, the Chandragupta did defeat the Shakas and sent them away.
Yes.
But at the same time, he needed to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So what does he do? He ties up, the matrimonial alliance between the Vakataka king and his daughter, Prabhavati.
Which I think was followed up until the end of the regency in Bharat. A lot of rajas actually by way of matrimonial alliances used to ensure either protection when the Mughals came in, when it was the time of the Mughals, or they ensured that there's alliance which will allow them to rule peacefully.
If you look at again, I'm being very blunt
No,
now.
please be.
You
This
look at
is-
the
this is
upper
the place
echelons of
to be
society also, right?
Yeah.
Industrialist families also, marriages are not necessarily out of love or what you say. They're
a
also
very interesting
alliances.
statement.
Sorry to say, but they're also alliances.
Especially given the fact that we recently had a big fat marriage.
Yes.
Wedding of.
That's what I said.
Yeah,
I'm being
yeah,
very
yeah.
frank. Yeah. So, and not
No, but
just
you're
in
very
India,
right.
and not just
You're
in
very
India, even abroad, marriages are not necessarily made. There is another
Especially between powerful, people,
families.
yeah.
So regencies continue to do that, and that's what Chandragupta did. But that's not to say that he kept interfering. Now there have been if you read between the lines, we don't know much about the 4th, 5th century anymore. There isn't that much archival material. There is a thought that says that he probably interfered, but I tend to disagree with it because you see, distances were quite India's a vast country,
Of course.
and we did not have aeroplanes or trains those days. So is it really possible for Chandragupta to keep interfering in what happened? I'm not saying that Prabhavati may not have consulted her father for some kind of inputs, but by and large, she was left all on her own. And also, what's very interesting is the Vakataka dynasty itself had a second branch called the Vatsal Gulma branch.
Okay.
So, if you that branch did not try to, that is again, they did not try to take over this kingdom.
Correct.
And throughout the 20 years that she ruled, or the 25 years that she ruled, and she continued to be in the limelight even after her son Pravarasena II took over as king. You know, because you do find inscriptions even after that.
Harni, tell me something. What would those states be for today? I mean, where Prabhavati ruled?
Maharashtra, Nagpur,
Maharashtra.
Nandivardhan. A very interesting fact, that really heartened me is when I had submitted the draft of the Curse of Anuganga. This was in 2018. It came out in 2019.
Right.
So I had finished the draft and sent it off to the publishers.
Ah.
That was then the news came out that the Nandivardhan area, Nagardhan, Nagpur area in Maharashtra was dug up, and they found the ruins.
Oh, wow. And there were inscriptions to suggest
The
that...
inscriptions had been found earlier. There was the Pune inscription and one more, where Prabhavati Gupta finds a mention. It's an inscription that she herself has given, saying that the grant of a particular set of villages to some Brahmins.
And for the history aficionados, if they need to learn more about that period, what are the books that you suggest one should refer to?
The go-to is a book by R.C. Majumdar and A.S. Altekar called The Vakataka Gupta Age.
Okay.
Besides that, R.C. Majumdar has this wonderful 9-set series published by Bharati Vidya Bhavan on history of India. So now that is not necessarily for the Gupta period. Volume number 3 is the Gupta period
Gupta
there.
period. Okay.
That's another thing. And there is a lot of research there. JSTOR has a lot of articles on the Gupta period.
And yet we fail to have a detailed mention of it in the history books in school.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Now, coming to the point where you mentioned that, she had 3 sons, and for some reason, when I researched about her online, which is not a very great platform to research, especially when you're going to Wikipedia, and given all the controversial, news that comes in about Wikipedia being handled by the left-wing historians, you don't find a mention of her first son taking over naturally. And it's in fact the second son, when he grows up to attaining the age of adulthood, is when he takes over as the king. Because she had lost her husband when all 3 were quite young, and she was the regent managing the affairs there. So why, what, if you would like to share as to why would that be, do you think?
I found a very brief mention in one of the books that I had read. I don't remember exactly which one. The inference I think it was A.S. Altekar itself, the inference was that he passed away. So there was nothing controversial about it.
Okay.
It wasn't the second son trying to usurp the throne by from the elder brother.
This is very interesting, because this is exactly how it is mentioned on Wikipedia.
It's not
that, it is something where there was some, she maybe fell for power, and she didn't want to hand over the power to the first one. So if you read about her on Wikipedia, that's how they portray her.
In fact, what I have read in A.S. Altekar, I think, or one of the many, I don't even remember how many books or
you
articles
referred
I've
to, yeah.
referred to, but the inference that I took out from there was that there is a mention somewhere, it says that she probably was willing to she was waiting to hand it over and retire, but she had to extend it because her son died.
Before we go on to another queen who similarly took over in the absence of her son attaining adulthood and she losing her husband, I want to also probably talk to you about weaving a fictional story around historical characters, or setting it in history in times when you were never born, you can only read of, and especially when you are referring to such vast material in history, and then just picking the right things from it to weave it into a story and include it. First, tell me about that entire process and art of, putting together a fictional story around history.
It's tough.
I can imagine.
First phrase that comes to mind. But the whole thing is, see, I guess when I'm writing a story, it's about human beings. I see them as human beings. Yes, they lived in a different time period than us. I mean, come on, 3 centuries from now, we will become like them, right? Like, we'll be characters who lived in a certain part of the world. So, but essentially, I believe that human beings have the same passions, have the same problems, have the same, lust for money, love, hate, revenge, lust for power. That's not going to go away anywhere. So I see them as human beings. So then I kind of plot it out. The research happens side by side, and while I'm plotting the story, then I need to be cognizant of the fact that such and such a thing could have happened. I can't have an aeroplane suddenly appear in the Gupta period. It is anachronistic. So I need to be true and faithful to that particular time. The difficulty that comes in is how much history to get in and how much to leave out. Because when you're doing historical research, there are all these little, and especially if you're passionate about history, there are all these little bits that you want to, you're like, oh my God, this happened, oh my God, that happened.
I know, and you don't know where
and
to
you don't
stop.
know where
So
to stop.
how do you make that decision of where to stop?
I think in the first book, I was a little bit, I would say a little raw,
Okay.
as a writer, because I think there are times where I probably got in a little bit more history than required. But at the same time, how this is again me trying to convince myself that no, it was not that, is that I was trying to create a world. Historical fiction is about setting the context. So the world view has to be in place. The world has to be in place. So I was busy setting the Gupta period world in The Curse of Anuganga. In the second one, when I wrote Shadows and Secrets, I was much more aware when I was writing, saying, okay, is this historical fact really needed to the story? Is it progressing the story? Because ultimately I'm writing fiction, not non-fiction. The plot has to kind of keep moving, and the reader would be reading it, would want the story to progress. So any historical digression could actually land up delaying the story and making the story, the pace.
It'll lose its pace.
It loses its pace.
Especially when it's a thriller and a
yes,
murder mystery.
if it's a thriller. But having said that, also there are certain places where the pace has to be slow in a historical fiction book, because you need to kind of get the reader to believe and to imagine that he or she is not sitting in Delhi, India in 2024.
Also, just give a context.
To give a context, yeah.
You've also brought in people of different faith in your second book, that is Shadows and Secrets. In fact, I won't let out the story much, but you have shown interactions and cohabitants, not only cohabitants, but how they engage with each other and how the story develops, not just around a certain particular people of particular faith, but there is interfaith interaction as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
See, because if you look at India, India has always been in the helm of foreign trade, has always existed.
True.
So it isn't difficult, and at that time Patliputra was a magnificent city. In all realms of human existence, the Gupta period was the golden age.
Correct.
So it's not inconceivable for me, to think that, okay, there would be traders, there would be people of different countries visiting and staying there in a vast bustling city like Patliputra. So if you have that happening,
And engaging in murders as well. Well, no,
yes, engaging in murders as well, but they're human too.
No, that's true. But taking a cue from there, the previous part of this conversation where we were talking about a region taking over because of losing her husband and the child being very young, another such, queen was Ahilyabai Holkar.
Yes.
And unfairly again, I think Ahilyabai Holkar, people have come to know of her from a recent series or serial that has come on TV a couple of years ago. And before that, I don't think she was part of the popular imagination,
That
so
is
to say.
actually very sad, because if Hindu Dharma has been protected, a major credit would go to her. Look at
Absolutely.
the number of temples that she has restored. From Badrinath, Kedarnath. I mean,
Right up to
Varanasi.
Kashi. Yeah, yeah.
Not just Kashi, even Udupi. I was reading
Yes.
Udupi and down south as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
Kashi, Prayagraj.
I wonder what a
Kedarnath.
clarity of thought would she have, and the other queens would have had, who actually led the path of Dharma by first and foremost not just running their kingdoms properly and fairly, but because you rarely find mention of them being unfair or cruel. Probably that maternal instinct always governed their.
And from my whatever, I haven't read that much on Ahilya Holkar, but whatever I've read, the sense that I've got is that she's a woman of piety. She's a very pious woman, so I think she really did believe in that dharma. So she was not hankering behind power and all. So, and if you are, if you are such a believer of dharma, or if you lead a dharmic life, when you're same principles don't hold true whatever work you're doing. And I think it was just an extension of the person that she was, which is why you will not find anything. And that is something that surprisingly a lot more women, a lot more queens that we're talking about all embodied this actually.
Oh, absolutely. The queen that I mentioned in the beginning of the show from Uttarakhand, Rani Karnavati. So she was, in fact, I was amazed when I read about having a woman warrior, a woman regent from my place who actually pushed back, not just pushed back, but also defeated the Mughals. Yes, and she was popularly known as Nakkati, and none other than Shah Jahan himself gave her that connotation.
Yeah.
So the interesting story goes that somewhere in 16, I think, 30s, she took over because she lost her husband to one of the wars, and her son was very young. And obviously, she had to take over. And unlike her husband, who was crazy about picking up wars with nearby kingdoms, she went more the dharmic way. If you look at it, she was more focused on development. She in fact today in Dehradun, the Rajpur Canal is said to be built by her. That those many years ago. So having such clarity of thought, having such focus for her own people, she continued to rule. And then, I think Kumaon and Garhwal have had a history of being warriors. I mean, they've been warring with each other for, I think, centuries, for some strange reason. And there was this, Baz Bahadur Chand, who took over as the Kumaon ruler. And because he always wanted to take over Garhwal, what he did was he got one of the ministers of Shah Jahan excited about the prospects of winning over Garhwal and going back rich with all the riches that Garhwal had to offer. So it's a very interesting story, and it is actually chronicled by foreign historians who were traveling here and who chronicled it. And one of the French chroniclers says that Manucci, I think the chronicler's name was, and he shared how what happened was that. So they took permission, and they with a troop of about 30,000 people, and with the help of the ruler of Kumaon and also another ruler, he crossed the Ganga and entered Haridwar. And very interestingly, instead of giving up and what Rani Karnavati actually did was she allowed the troops to enter, and then she sealed the borders. And because you always have an advantage, they receded to the top of the hills. And because you have an advantage if you're fighting a battle from above, she actually defeated them with her small troops and ensured that none of them left without, having their nose cut. So that is one part of history I think nobody is aware of, that Mughal accession and their lust for power and taking over lands also took them to Garhwal, but they were never successful with that. Similarly, I think coming back to Ahilya Bai, I think when you talk about her, so pious, and so I mean she used to be so engaged in building temples and renovating temples, and
Thanks,
yeah. So I mean, that speaks a lot about the feminist, the Bharatiya feminist, so to say, Bharatiya feminism, so to say. You are ruling, and still you are not aping the West, you know,
not
the way
aping
you
the-
are
not at all.
today. And you are so well settled into your identity and so proud of it. So I think, and you know, today being a mother, I realize many a times that being religiously inclined or being spiritual or being dharmic, uh, uh, you know, in a way brings in so much of center in your own self, but also helps your children, you know, in a lot of ways in trying to, because they are learning from your actions. So I feel that, you know, women of today have somewhere in their in their this, to make a fashion statement of themselves and say that, you know, we are the feminists, have been aping something which is not theirs really.
You see, the feminist movement, the suffrage came from the
Suffragist movement,
That
yes.
was
A very American,
very American
huh,
thing, and it
correct.
suited that particular society.
True.
We can't just take it and say, okay, now we are going to use this. See,
Yeah.
one size does not fit all in this case.
Absolutely.
So I mean, so that's what I said.
So it's not wrong to say that women of Bharat were always very
We were
independent.
always very independent.
People of their own minds. We did not have the similar challenges as it's portrayed that we had, that the women of West had. In fact, I feel the way the West treated their women up as early as 1920s was appalling.
It was appalling. Women neither could vote, they couldn't read or write. I mean, there were a lot of things that were denied to them. But that was not the case in India, in Bharat actually. Ahilya Bai Holkar, she was the daughter of Mr. Manoji Shinde, Shri Manoji Shinde, who I think was a patil of that village,
Correct.
village where she lived. She was taught to read and write. And if you read about the Gupta period, women were basically taught everything. They were it was not something, but there was no discrimination per se.
True.
The social stratification and even the Varna system that kind of started that solidification or codification happened much later, towards the end of the Gupta period.
And I think it was
And even
also
after that,
induced a lot
women
by the invaders that came in
Much
from
later.
The,
So I think, it was
yeah, it was again a more British and the
Yes.
Mughal thing that brought in
Brought
the
in-
Parda system,
brought in-
the differentiation.
exactly all that was much later, not in ancient India.
Right, right. Let's move on to a little south, a little more south, and talk about the Chola Queen, the Sembian Mahadevi. Why don't you share something about her?
I mean, she was, I think,
This is the first time I heard of her, actually. When you mentioned it yesterday is when I heard of her. And it is every time I come across a new...
the Chola dynasty is fascinating, and it's a pity
absolutely.
that we don't really know much about
and the
it.
only film that we can think of on the Chola dynasty, again, in some way doesn't
Ponniyin Selvan.
Yeah, and
But see, that was because he, I think Mr. Mani Ratnam was trying to cram 5 volumes of a book, into two-part movie,
correct, yeah.
And I think he made it with the assumption that whoever is watching it would have read Ponniyin Selvan to begin with.
Yeah.
So if you've read the book, you know what's happening on the screens. You can't just go in without. If you go in without reading it, of course, it'll be very confusing.
No, and you're
But
very right. It's very confusing. I have not read the book, and when we started watching it, I couldn't.
You
make
would
sense
not.
of it, yeah.
So he's not catering to the people, I guess, because
haven't read
Ponniyin
it, yeah.
Selvan is an amazing historical fiction work by Kalki Krishnamurti, and it's a classic in Tamil Nadu because it was a serialized book. So in, I think, between 1950 to 55, I'm not sure about the dates now, but that was when it came out in Kalki as in installments. So everybody of that particular generation and all would have heard of Ponniyin Selvan in Tamil. Anyone who knows Tamil literature. So his attempt to put that on screen is amazing. But coming back to the Chola dynasty,
Interesting. Even with Periyar's influence, he could write such volumes of historical fiction.
but I think whatever I've seen in the South, Dharma still continues. But whatever I've seen in my visits to Tamil Nadu and Tamil Nadu essentially, people are very dharmic.
There's a very political question since you brought this up. currently the DMK is governing, and they've been making all sorts of
Making all
obnoxious
sorts of
statements.
obnoxious statements.
Uh, how do you think? How do you see this changing? Because I do know that DMK has the prolifertarian influence. They want to Christianize the entire South.
Yes.
And the best way of killing a civilization is to detach it from its history. That's exactly what the Marxist historians
which is
did.
sadly what's happening
Yeah.
there, because South India, when you're growing up in South India, whatever, at least I'm talking from when I was growing up, not right now, everybody would be taught certain shlokas and all.
True.
And now all these things, shlokas that were meant for Devis or Vishnu, Krishna, Shiva, suddenly you have a Jesus Stotra also happening.
Wow.
So you're
Okay.
trying to canonize, get him included in the faith, so that the people whom you're trying to kind of buy over to your side, they will think, okay, we're worshipping our God only,
Yeah,
It's
and
the
it is
way of
actually
conversion.
true that I see them dressing him up like Krishna and Rama, and
So that's the way,
yeah.
because otherwise the faith there was very strong. You go to
Do you
Tamil Nadu.
think they are going to push back in the coming decades the way?
I hope so.
I would really want to ask you about that bindi thing, the tika, this kumkum thing, but we'll get to that after having talked about the Chola Queen. Give us a little bit about Sembrian.
Sembian Dev Mahadevi was the first queen of Chola. First queen, and then first. See, not much is known about the Chola dynasty before Rajaraja Chola. So this a lady, she would have been the queen of. She was the wife of somebody known as Ganaraditya Chola or Parantaka I. Okay, and after that, he died. He died. So she was queen as long as he was alive. Then she became the Dowager queen, and after that came somebody called Arinjaya, his son, and his son or brother. Okay, now I'm getting confused. So after Arinjaya died, Arinjaya's ideally. This Arinjaya was his brother. Yeah, sorry. So Ganaraditya and Semba Mahadevi's son, Madhurantaka Uttama Chola, he should have actually become the king, but I think he was a minor then, which is why Arinjaya, the brother, took over, and Arinjaya's son, Sundara Chola, became king as Sundara Chola Parantaka II.
Okay.
Now, Parantaka II's son is Arulmozhi Varman, who became Rajaraja Chola. But if you realize, if you watched Ponniyin Selvan, at the end, the uncle becomes this thing. So, Sembiya Mahadevi is the uncle's mother, Uttama Chola's mother.
Okay.
So, even though she was queen only when her husband was ruling, she was the dowager queen after that who had an amazing influence on the entire kingdom, irrespective of whether she or her son were in power per se. And it was because of her piety. She was an extremely pious religious woman who went around, who spent giving grants, restoring temples. So what she did is converting all the brick temples that existed into, she was a Shiva Bhakt, into the stone temples. And what is amazing is she restored even she engraved whatever the earlier inscription was, and then added her inscription to it. In fact, there is a small village or town called Sembiya Mahadevi Pattiyan, I think, which still exists, and there's a temple there. And on her, and back in those days, on her birthday, the star birthday, the Hindu nakshatra birthday, there would be this entire celebration where she would kind of in the temple, and it's like praying to goddess, not her, but goddess as such.
Okay.
And the kind of work she has done, again, typical, similar to what Ahilya Devi Holkar had done. She was doing that, and she was still remembered.
And
So
it
much
is
so
not
that
just about building temples, but quite like Ahilya Bai Holkar, she was also helping in developing, taking decisions that developed economy, craftsmanship.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Throughout. I think if you look at, images from the Chola period in search in Google, there is one thing that comes up, a bronze statue in the
yes.
Tribhanga.
Yeah,
This thing,
yeah.
you must have seen it.
I've seen it.
There
Very
has-
popular.
Very popular. So there has been a whole debate of whether it is an image of her, because there were, images cast for kings and queens, or is it Parvati?
Okay.
Okay. And
But there is a tradition of, praying to women leaders as gods and goddesses
That's
in,
now.
in the South.
That's
No,
now.
it wasn't there in the
wasn't there.
ancient India. So it must have
She
been.
was like the mother, you know. She was.
Ah.
No, of course, they were venerated. They were respected. I don't think. I don't know if that was there. From my knowledge, I don't think it was there.
It reiterates in a lot of ways that women of Dharma are the real feminists, so to say. If you
They are. Look at Kundavai for that matter. Kundavai is Rajaraja Chola's sister. She was married to a small tribal chieftain of that time, another very close friend, ally. I think he was there in the movie also. Even then, she did not leave Tanjavur or stayed very much as a part of the Chola dynasty and guided and influenced both her brother and later her nephew Rajendra Chola. That is agency, right? She has a husband, she would keep going and yet coming back.
Correct, yeah. Interesting. Now, since you mentioned this about while talking about Sembian, that she had a lot of clout and she had influence over the kingdom, moving from the queens to somebody, a woman of influence, and that was Shantala, the Hoysala dynasty, where she was not really the regent or the queen, but she
Was a queen. She was
a queen.
She was not the regent.
Okay.
She was the Hoysala king Vishnuvardhan's wife.
So that she was a queen but not a regent, right? But she had a lot of influence on the
Extreme influence. I mean, influence, like, there is this story that goes about her. I don't know how much of it is true. But what is that she was a very famous, she was a very good dancer and she was very beautiful. And Vishnuvardhan's mother had her eyes set on her and said, okay, I want my son to see her and get married to her. Now, she was a Jain and she remained a Jain throughout. And I think at that point in time, Vishnuvardhan was also a Jain king.
Right.
The entire Hoysala dynasty was Jain, followed Jainism. So then he sees her dance and obviously he gets married to her, and he wanted to marry her. He agreed to marry her. She puts her foot down. She says, I don't want to be separated from my best friend,
Acha.
Lakshmi. So I'm not coming.
Oh.
Okay. So then the king had to actually marry both her and this lady
wow.
Lakshmi and take them both there.
Interesting.
And the story still continues, though I've heard two variations of what happens next. One this thing is that she does not have a child, whereas Lakshmi does have a child. So she says he should be the next prince. You make her the main queen, because Shantala was the main queen, the Mahapatrani or whatever. I think her epithet also was, Sobriquet, or Sobriquet, right? Is Patta Mahadevi, so the main queen.
Okay.
Okay, Patrani.
Queens of queens.
Queen. So she's like, no, make her that, because she's given birth to a son. He refuses. So apparently then she kills herself. That's what they say.
Okay.
But the other story that I've heard is that as a Jaina, she was really against, Ahimsa. She was really a follower of Ahimsa. Okay? And some war happens and that causes a lot of destruction. She had warned him, and in fact, apparently even extracted a promise from her husband not to go to war. But he does.
Okay.
And in the typical Jaina tradition, she starves herself to death.
Oh. Okay.
But again, the amount of influence she had in that region, you go to those Belur Halebi temples, all the, Madanikas, the carvings are said to be modeled on her.
Okay.
Because she was that beautiful. And she had a lot of tanks, a lot of temples, restored a lot of temples, Despite being a Jaina, she kind of was responsible for construction of many temples, because her husband, Vishnuvardhan, converted to Sri Vaishnavism at that point in time.
I've read about Ashoka, and it was in Odisha, where after the Battle of Kalinga, he decided to, it's incorrectly mentioned though, that he embraced Buddhism. He was already a Buddhist when he was fighting wars, but something happened in Kalinga which changed his heart, and he gave up on the warrior side of it and became the more humanist that he is portrayed later on in his inscriptions. But there is a historical figure from Odisha who we must talk about another queen that comes from Odisha and we've never heard of her. So, Harini, who was she?
She was Tribhuvana Mahadevi I from the Bhaumakara dynasty. So this would be around 9th century.
Wow.
Okay. And like Ahilya, she kind of got into power when her husband died. And then her son, unfortunately, her son also died,
Oh.
leaving behind an infant son. So she had stepped down from being queen when her son took over, but again, son died too soon. So she came back as the regent queen and continued to rule for nearly around 20-30 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
And she was an extremely powerful figure. She has been mentioned by Arabic travelers also about that such a powerful lady ruler existed. Again, the thing about nurturing the kingdom and as well as protecting its boundaries. And she likened herself and she compared herself to one of the goddesses, I think Parvati or somebody, and said that, look, I'm like her. So you see, you've
Listen to me.
to me. But she had it all under control.
But tell me something.
And
a
the
lot of-
Bhaumakara dynasty, incidentally, Lipika, had a lot of queens. And they were not queens as in like this. So it's like much later also.
how big was this dynasty? Where was it spread?
It was all in the Kalinga. That
Okay.
Odisha is what
The
I
current
remember. See,
Odisha region.
Odisha region. I'm not very sure about
The exact boundaries.
the exact
yeah.
boundaries, but they had some 2-3 queens.
That means a good 200-300 years of rule.
100 years for sure.
100 years.
100 years for sure.
But it is interesting to see. Do you perceive this as a very patriarchal move, that because you've lost a husband and the kings usually their sons always took over. It is only when the son died that the wife was allowed to rule up until the point when her son attained a age of maturity. Or do you look at it
I
patriarchally?
don't look at it patriarchally because see, or maybe it is patriarchy. I haven't really paid it much thought. But when you see the divisions of what a woman did and a man did were very well sorted out, right? So instead of asking that was she allowed to take over, what if she herself chose not to take over? We don't know that.
We don't know it. Correct.
We don't know whether she was stopped from becoming the queen when her husband died and the son took over, or whether that's what she wanted and she pushed her son to the forefront.
True.
Like Ahilya Devi, been coming back to her, Ahilya Bai Holkar, when her daughter was of marriageable age, you know what she did, right? She was the first, probably one of the very few queens who did not get her daughter married to a prince.
Interesting. I think it's been a fabulous conversation, going back in history with you and learning so much more about these queens. I do hope, after this episode, not just these, but there are so many more queens like Velu Nachiyar and Rani Durgavati
so
and
many,
others. So many of them that they go back and read about and feel proud of, because these are the women of Bharat who actually are to be idolized instead of the new modern history that the kind of people and women that we are made to idolize. I think talk to your children about them, talk to your teenagers about them, read about them yourselves. It's fascinating to know what all their contributions have been to ensure continuity in this land of Dharma. In the next segment, Harini, we talk about our roots, because the idea behind this podcast is of the hundreds and thousands of people who watch it. Even if 10% of them, after listening to this segment, try and find out about their roots and where they came from and their ancestors came from, I think one part of instilling the dharmic beginnings, starts from there. It happened with me. But I want to know about you. Where do your ancestors hail from?
I can go into a history lesson for that.
Please do. You are good at it.
So my version that I usually tell people
Yeah.
is that I'm a Tamilian from Karnataka. Okay.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I'll dig deeper.
Ah.
Okay. We go back to the 11th century India.
Mm.
There was a king in the Chola dynasty
Okay.
who was called Krimantaka Chola,
Okay.
or who was also, you can know him as Kulotunga Chola.
Mhm.
And apparently, he was a Shaivite.
Okay.
Okay. And he started persecuting the Vaishnavites, especially a very famous Acharya, saint called Sri Ramanujacharya. There is another theory that he did not have anything against the Vaishnavites, but he had something against Ramanujacharya.
Okay.
So Ramanujacharya was told to basically escape, otherwise he would have lost his life.
Okay.
So along with him, some of his disciples and followers moved
to
to the Hoysala dynasty where Vishnuvardhana was ruling.
Ah.
And Ramanujacharya converted Vishnuvardhana into a Sri Vaishnava. Okay.
Ah.
And while of course later Ramanujacharya left and came back to Tamil Nadu, to what is present day Tamil Nadu, Tanjavur region. But some of his followers continue to stay there, and a lot of people would have been around that region, which is Hassan district and Mysore district, Mandya district in Karnataka, got converted.
Oh, okay.
So they are my ancestors. Just
Wow,
to say, I
that's
belong
quite
to that.
an ancestry to
I
have.
belong to the community called Mysore Ayengars or Hebbar Ayengars.
Yeah.
Ayengars. So Sri Vaishnavas, originally of course still followers of Sri Ramanujacharya, but who lived in Karnataka and adapted to the Kannada way of life. In this, there's not that much of a difference following our Sri Vaishnavism, while speaking a dialect now, which is a mixture of Tamil and Kannada. Now, those are my ancestors. So I come from Hassan district, Karnataka.
Interesting. We discussed two queens from the two regions that Harini's ancestors belong from. So, thank you very much, Harini,
Thank
for sharing those details with us. I do hope. How do you tell your son about it? About your ancestry and this history? Does he know about it?
He knows about it, but is he interested in it? That's another question.
No, that's a struggle we all parents have to, I think, have.
No, but he's very much aware of it. And we do make it a point to go to Tamil Nadu every year.
Nice.
You know, there are these 2-3 temples that we visit. And for the last 10 years now, we've made it a point that every December we go there.
South has been largely given a lot of credit for withholding the dharmic roots, which I think is recently under threat. But tell me something, there's a very interesting conversation that we've had in the past, and I would like to record it, is on the kumkum. It's a couple of years ago since I started applying the tilak. The reasons were very personal in a lot of ways. There's nothing political about it, but I feel every morning after my prayers, if I apply the tilak, I feel a little more confident, probably for some strange reason. But in the South, it's a practice that without the kumkum, you don't step out.
Yes.
Yeah.
See,
And you had you couldn't, primarily because
I studied in a school, in a Christian school.
Yeah.
So there were rules about not wearing the kumkum or the bindi, because otherwise in the South you're not supposed to leave. The bindi is not a sign of whether you're married or unmarried there. Okay?
Everybody applies
Everybody has to put. If you see, even the men would apply a little bit of that, or the vibhuti or something. Your forehead is not to be left bare.
True.
So growing up in Delhi, it just meant that I didn't do it. And
Delhi did a lot of destruction to a whole lot of us who came from different parts of the country and studied here. But interestingly, it's, how different it is when it comes to probably schools suggesting that you can't wear a certain attire or have certain practices. Whereas we have, if you look at it, all the Christian schools have been enforcing a rule against the use of dharmic symbols. Sorry to have interrupted.
So my wearing the kumkum, of course, in the beginning it was more like, oh my God.
Are you aware of the reason for doing that? What is the reason behind it?
Oh, one of the things that I've heard from my grandmother, its belief is, see, this is the third eye. You get a lot of vibrations, right? So and you don't know what kind of intention people look at you or you meet with. So to protect yourself and this thing, you need to this is a protection.
Correct.
That is what I've heard from my grandmother.
People who study the chakras in the body, right from Muladhara to Sahasrara, they also say
Yes,
that
chakra is right
there is
here.
a chakra.
Yeah. So you cover that
Cover that,
basically. So
right.
that is the reason. Going back to what you said about you feeling confident, I think that's what prayer does, right? I mean, and the dharmic values, just lighting a little lamp and saying a few mantras, shlokas in the morning gives me a lot of solace and confidence
And I
for the
think
day.
it's very essential because just 2 days ago there was another suicide that occurred in our society. It is, I think, the third or the fourth in the last 2 years. And we realized that, people, especially the younger generation, is so weak in their belief systems that they get shattered with a bat of the eye. I mean, they need to strengthen, and in order to bring that strength and strengthen their value systems, I think it's all the more important for us to talk about how we can get back to our roots and inculcate that dharmic value system. That, and by dharma I don't mean that you have to follow certain practices forcefully, but by dharma I mean that this is to be made part of your life to ensure that you have
Exactly.
a strong willpower, you develop a strong inner self, and dharma does that for you.
Dharma does that. Just a basic prayer every morning, lighting the lamp, that's all.
True.
No? And reciting one or two shlokas that you're comfortable with. Nothing more.
Nothing more. No, but fabulous. Thank you so much,
Thank you
Harini.
very much, Deepika.
It was good fun having this long conversation. I think the last one we had was just about 10 minutes when we recorded in Pune.
Pune, na?